Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a warm drink, and settle in. Today, we journey back in time, not to a world of gleaming marble temples, but to a society of iron will, where the very concept of childhood was forged into a weapon. Listen closely. Beneath the wind whistling down from the peaks, you can almost hear the ghost of a lullaby, but it is not soft and sweet. It is the rhythmic, percussive beat of marching feet, a metronome for a life of discipline. Ultimately, the Spartan child was a social experiment. The experiment's hypothesis was, can we, through relentless conditioning and the removal of all external softness, create a human being whose sole purpose is the defense and glorification of the state? For a few centuries, the experiment yielded terrifyingly successful results. It created a society that valued duty over love, honor over life, and the collective over the self. But like any extreme experiment, it was unstable. What did it feel like to be 7 years old and watch your father lead you away from your mother, knowing you would not return to live in that home again? The historical sources are silent on the child's perspective, focusing instead on the system's logic. But we must try to imagine it. The terror and confusion must have been overwhelming. The state demanded this separation, framing it as a necessity for the boy's development. But for the child, it was the abrupt end of his world. Let's focus on the figure of the iron, the 20-year-old youth placed in charge of a pack of younger boys. Having just survived the agoge himself, he was now tasked with inflicting its rigors on the next generation. This was a brilliant piece of psychological design by the state. It gave the iron his first taste of real authority, testing his leadership skills. More importantly, it forced him to internalize the system's values by becoming its enforcer. The absence of privacy was a constant reality for a Spartan child in the agoge. He slept in a communal barracks, ate in a group, and exercised under the watchful eyes of his peers and elders. There was no space to be alone with his thoughts, no refuge from the relentless pressure to conform. This was entirely by design. Privacy allows for the development of an inner life, of individuality, which was precisely what the Spartan state sought to prevent. We often focus on the physical brutality, but the mental games were just as harsh. The Arenes would frequently test the boys with questions at mealtimes, expecting clever, witty, and appropriately laconic answers. A slow or foolish response would earn a boy punishment, sometimes a bite to the thumb. This wasn't just about encouraging wit. It was about training the mind to be sharp, disciplined, and performative even in a supposedly relaxed setting. Let's consider the relationship between two boys of the same age within a pack. It would have been a complex mix of camaraderie and rivalry. This boy was your brother in suffering, the only one who truly understood the hunger and the cold you both endured. You relied on him for support in group contests and mock battles. Yet, he was also your direct competitor. Every time he was praised, it was an implicit criticism of you. The Spartan system had a unique way of dealing with law and order among the boys. Instead of a formal set of written rules, discipline was largely delegated to the older boys and the ever-present citizens. If an adult saw a boy misbehaving, he was not only allowed but expected to punish him on the spot. Furthermore, the adult was then expected to report his punishment to the boy's iron, who would then often punish the boy a second time for having needed correction from an outsider. The famous story of the boy who stole a fox, as told by Plutarch, perfectly encapsulates the Spartan ethos. The boy had successfully stolen a live fox and hidden it under his cloak. To avoid being discovered by his elders, he allowed the desperate animal to claw and bite at his stomach, remaining silent and impassive. He held his composure until the fox had literally disemboweled him, and he dropped dead at their feet. Let's explore the role of music more deeply. The Spartans believed that certain musical modes could create courage and order, while others led to weakness and decadence. They favored the Dorian mode, which was seen as dignified, strong, and masculine. The music taught to children in the ago, played on the lyre and the aulos, a type of pipe, was carefully controlled. It was used to set the rhythm for marching and for the intricate movements of choral dances, which were themselves a form of military drill. The Spartan view of marriage and procreation was profoundly unsentimental and clinical. Marriage was a civic duty, not a private romance. A man was expected to marry to produce children for the state. If a man was married to a beautiful and fertile woman but was old, it was considered acceptable and even encouraged for him to invite a younger, stronger warrior to impregnate his wife, ensuring the offspring would be of the highest quality. The earth here was red, rich with iron. The Spartans believed this seeped into their souls, making them unyielding. A child born on this soil was born into a legacy of hardness, a pre-written destiny of stone and steel. What happened to a Spartan boy when he got sick or injured? The system had little tolerance for it. An injury sustained in a sanctioned athletic contest or mock battle might be seen as a mark of honor, but chronic illness or a constitution that couldn't handle the rigors of the agoge would have been seen as a sign of fundamental weakness. There was no concept of nursing a child back to health with rest and comfort. The boy would be expected to endure his illness with the same stoicism he endured a flogging. The relationship a Spartan girl had with her own body was unique in the ancient world. While an Athenian girl was taught to be modest and hidden, a Spartan girl was taught to display her body's strength and fitness as a mark of pride and civic virtue. She exercised publicly, competed in sports, and participated in religious processions in minimal clothing. This was not seen as licentious, but as a testament to the health of the state's future mothers. The Spartan landscape itself, particularly the valley of the Eurotas River, is geographically constrained, bordered by the high mountain ranges of Taygetus and Parnon. This geographic isolation reinforced their cultural isolation. For a child growing up there, the mountains were not just a backdrop. They were the edges of the known, safe world. Everything beyond them was foreign, other, and potentially hostile. Let's consider the specific skills taught in their war games. These were not just chaotic brawls. They would have involved learning the fundamentals of hoplite warfare, how to hold a shield to protect not only yourself, but the man to your left, how to handle a spear in tight formation, how to advance in a coordinated line, and how to perform complex maneuvers as a single unit. These games were practical, hands-on lessons that built the muscle memory required for the phalanx. The Spartan child had a very different relationship with animals than we might expect. They were not pets to be coddled. They were either tools or targets. Hunting dogs were prized for their skill and ferocity, valued as partners in the chase, which was itself a form of military training. The wild animals in the hills, like boars and wolves, were adversaries to be overcome, tests of a boy's courage and skill. The few possessions a Spartan boy had were likely communal or state tissue. The idea of personal property as an extension of one's identity was actively discouraged. This economic minimalism had a profound psychological effect. It prevented the development of materialism and envy over possessions. Instead, envy and ambition were redirected towards intangible things: honor, reputation, and status within the group's hierarchy. The moment of graduation from the agoge, when a man joined a sedition, was not an end to his training but a change in its form. He now entered a lifetime of continuous military readiness. His days were still structured around communal exercise and drills. His evenings were spent dining with the same men he would fight alongside. The sedition was a permanent military unit and a social club rolled into one. Imagine the perspective of a helot child watching the Spartan boys. The helot child would have seen these privileged youths undergoing their brutal training. They would have seen them stealing food, engaging in mock battles, and being drilled relentlessly. For the helot child, the Spartan boy was not a peer, but a future master and a potential threat. He was the embodiment of the oppressive system that kept his family in bondage. The role of older women in a boy's life, particularly after he entered the agoge, was minimal but significant. His mother, whom he would see infrequently, was expected to be a source of ideological reinforcement, not comfort. She would ask about his training, praise his toughness, and shame any sign of weakness. Other citizens' wives and mothers also played a role. Any woman could and was expected to reprimand a boy who was misbehaving. Let's focus on the act of making his own bed. Each year, a boy in the agoge had to go to the riverbank and, without a knife, break off reeds to make his mattress. This simple task was a lesson in itself. It taught self-sufficiency. It accustomed him to discomfort, as a reed bed would be hard and cold. And the prohibition of a knife for this task was a lesson in resourcefulness and a test of the toughness of his hands. Childhood is a garden where innocence is meant to bloom. But in Sparta, this garden was deliberately unwatered, its soil turned over with the spade of austerity, ensuring only the toughest, most resilient shoots would survive. The Spartans were famous for their long hair, a privilege granted only to men who had completed the agoge and become warriors. For a boy in the barracks, the long hair of the older men would have been a powerful symbol of status and achievement. It was a visual marker of adulthood and warrior status, something to aspire to. Before a battle, the long-haired Spartan warriors would famously take their time combing and dressing their hair. How did the agoge address sexuality beyond the institutional pederasty? The system was designed to delay heterosexual activity. By keeping men in the barracks until age 30 and making them sneak out to see their wives, the state minimized the time and emotional energy men spent on their families, redirecting it towards their military unit. This also meant that men and women married when they were both physically mature, which the Spartans believed would produce healthier children. The public shaming rituals were a powerful tool. It wasn't just cowards who were shamed. Bachelors who failed to marry by a certain age were also publicly humiliated, sometimes forced to march around the marketplace in winter singing a song about how they deserved their punishment. This shows how every aspect of private life, including the decision to marry, was considered a matter of public concern and civic duty. It's important to recognize that the Spartan system was an ideal that was likely not always perfectly realized. The ancient sources, particularly Plutarch, wrote centuries after Sparta's peak, and may have romanticized the system's efficiency and uniformity. In reality, there would have been boys who found ways to circumvent the rules, Irenes who were lazy or overly cruel, and moments of kindness and humanity that the official ideology sought to stamp out. The end of a Spartan's life was meant to mirror its beginning. Just as an infant's worth was judged by its physical fitness, an old man's worth was judged by his continued service to the state. The highest honor for an elder was to be elected to the Gerousia, the same council of elders that inspected the newborns. To qualify, a man had to be over 60 and have a lifetime record of impeccable virtue and service. This created a lifelong incentive to adhere to the Spartan code. In the final analysis, the childhood of a Spartan was a relentless process of subtraction. The system took away the comfort of a mother's arms, the security of a family home, the pleasure of varied food, the warmth of adequate clothing, the freedom of privacy, and the joy of unstructured play. It took away the luxury of complex thought and the freedom of personal ambition. Let's consider the concept of justice for a Spartan child. It was not based on fairness or rehabilitation, but on pure utility and discipline. If a boy was punished, it wasn't necessarily because he had done something morally wrong, but because he had acted in a way that was inefficient or undisciplined. The boy caught stealing was punished for his lack of skill, not his lack of morals. Fights between boys were encouraged, and the winner was praised not for being right, but for being stronger. The agoge can be seen as a form of sensory deprivation and overload. On one hand, it deprived boys of comfort, warmth, and flavor, dulling the senses that seek pleasure. On the other hand, it overloaded them with the sensations of pain, cold, and hunger, forcing them to build a tolerance for physical misery. This recalibration of the senses was crucial. It created men who were not distracted by the hardships of a military campaign. What was the role of humor in a Spartan child's life? It was not the giggling, silly humor of most children. It was the sharp, dry, laconic wit we have discussed. It was a humor of intellect and superiority, often used to put someone else down or to show one's own mental toughness. For example, when a visitor commented that the swords of the Spartans were short, a Spartan king replied, "They are long enough to reach the hearts of our enemies." The Spartan state's control over a child's life was so total that it even dictated the stories they were allowed to hear. Plato mentions in his Republic, a work heavily influenced by Spartan ideals, that the stories told to children must be carefully censored to portray the gods and heroes as virtuous and brave. The Spartans practiced this in reality. They rejected the poetry of Homer in its full form, disapproving of the way it showed gods squabbling and heroes weeping or showing fear. Forget the image of a laughing child chasing a ball. Picture instead a small boy, his face set, learning to stand impassive as a whip falls, learning that the expression of pain is a greater failure than the pain itself. The concept of the inferior, or hypomaion, is a critical, often overlooked aspect of the system. This class of men who had failed the agoge or lost their citizenship lived in a state of perpetual humiliation. They were a necessary component of the system, serving as a constant, living warning to the boys in training. The ever-present threat of ending up like them was a powerful motivator. The system didn't just need heroes to emulate, it needed failures to despise. Let us explore the girls' competitions. When they wrestled, ran, and threw the javelin, it was a form of public spectacle that had a dual purpose. For the girls, it was a test of their physical prowess and a way to gain honor and status. For the young men of the agoge, who were often spectators, it was a way to observe the strength and health of potential future wives. It turned courtship into a public exhibition of eugenic fitness. How did the agoge end? As Sparta's power waned after the Battle of Leuctra, the system began to decay. The strict rules against wealth were increasingly ignored, and the number of full citizens plummeted, making the traditional agoge difficult to maintain. By the Hellenistic period, it had become a shadow of its former self. The bond between a boy and his iron, his mentor, was the state's intended replacement for the father-son bond. This relationship was the primary conduit for the transmission of Spartan values. The iron taught not just military skills, but also the unwritten codes of honor, shame, and laconic speech. His praise was the highest reward a boy could receive, and his disapproval was a source of profound shame. The Spartan child was taught a different kind of history. It wasn't a critical inquiry into the past, but a sacred narrative of their own origins and destiny. The story of Lycurgus, their mythical lawgiver, was central. He was said to have received their laws directly from the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, giving their entire social structure a divine sanction. To question the laws of Lycurgus was to question the will of the gods. This foundation myth was crucial for maintaining social cohesion. Let us reflect on the senses. The sense of touch for a Spartan boy was dominated by hardness and pain. The hard ground he slept on, the sting of the whip, the cold of the river, the blows of his peers in mock battles. Moments of gentle, comforting touch were systematically eliminated. The sense of taste was defined by bitterness and scarcity, with the infamous black broth and the constant pangs of hunger. The uniformity demanded by the state extended to a boy's physical appearance. They were all given the same short haircut. They all wore the same single cloak. They were all expected to be lean and hard-bodied. This visual conformity was a powerful tool for erasing individuality. When everyone looks the same, it is easier to think of oneself as part of a collective rather than as a distinct person. The Crypteia deserves one more look, specifically its psychological effect on the boy who participated. To be sent into the countryside to live like an animal, and then to be tasked with murdering a helpless helot in the dead of night, must have been a profoundly transformative experience. It would have taught him to suppress empathy and to view killing not as a passionate act of battle, but as a cold, calculated tool of state policy. It was the final, brutal step in his desensitization. Imagine a festival day in Sparta. Unlike the chaotic, drunken revelries of other Greek states, a Spartan festival would have been a model of disciplined celebration. There would be athletic contests for boys and girls, showcasing the physical excellence of the citizenry. There would be great choral performances, where hundreds of citizens sang and danced in perfect, rehearsed unison. There would be solemn sacrifices to the gods. Spartan attitude towards literacy is telling. They were not illiterate, but they were alliterate. they deliberately chose not to base their culture around written texts. Laws were not elaborately written down but were memorized as retras or sayings. Treaties and formal declarations were of course written, but the deep philosophical and literary culture of a city like Athens was absent. For a child, this meant education was about listening, memorizing, and speaking, not about quiet, individual reading. To be a child was to be a piece of clay, not for a parent to lovingly shape, but for the state to mold upon its potter's wheel, spinning away all softness, all individuality, until only the required form remained. What if a boy simply ran away? Where could he go? The surrounding territories were either controlled by Sparta or were rival states that would have little use for a single fugitive boy. The mountains were harsh and difficult to survive in. More importantly, leaving the agoge meant abandoning his entire world. His family would be shamed, and he would have no identity, no skills other than those of a trainee warrior, and no place in any other society. The competitive nature of the agoge had a direct parallel in the lives of Spartan girls. They competed fiercely against each other in their athletic events. These competitions were not just for fun. They were a way to establish a hierarchy of honor and reputation among the young women. The victors were praised and would be seen as more desirable marriage partners. This taught the girls, just like the boys, that their worth was determined by their public performance and their physical excellence. Let's consider the concept of hope for a Spartan child. It would not have been a hope for a future of peace, prosperity, or personal happiness. Instead, hope would have been channeled into a very specific set of aspirations. The hope of being praised by his iron, the hope of winning a contest, the hope of being chosen for the crypteia, the hope of being accepted into a sedition, and ultimately the hope of earning glory in battle. The Spartan child was, in a sense, a public resource. The state's claim on him began at birth with the inspection, continued with his seizure at age 7, and lasted his entire life. Other citizens felt they had the right to discipline him, and his successes and failures were a matter of public record. This lack of a private sphere of life is a hallmark of totalitarian systems. The idea that a child belongs to his parents or even to himself was entirely alien. The agoge system required a massive amount of social consensus. For it to work, everyone, fathers, mothers, elders, and the boys themselves, had to believe in its necessity. This consensus was maintained through myth, religion, and tradition. The divine origin of their laws, the sacred memory of their heroes, and the constant fear of the helots all worked together to justify the system's brutality. In summary, to be a child in Sparta was to be born into a contract you never signed. The terms of the contract were simple: your individuality, your comfort, and your freedom in exchange for membership in the most elite and feared warrior society in the world. The training was the price you paid, a price extracted daily in hunger, cold, and pain. The glory of the state was the promised reward. The intense focus on the collective had a profound effect on a child's sense of self. A Spartan boy was taught to think in terms of we, not I. His successes were the pack's successes. His failures were the pack's shame. This is the psychological root of the phalanx's effectiveness. In a shield wall, a soldier's primary duty is to protect the man next to him. If one man's discipline fails, the entire formation can collapse. The agoge was a 13-year training program for this interdependent mindset. Let's examine the Spartan girls' role as enforcers of this ideology. The stories of their reactions are legendary. A mother is told that her son died bravely in battle, and she says, "This is as it should be." Another is told her son fled, and she is said to have killed him herself for the disgrace. While likely exaggerated, these stories reveal the ideal. Women were the guardians of Spartan honor at home. The agoge was, in essence, an early form of behaviorism. It was based on a simple system of stimulus, response, and reinforcement. The stimulus was the endless series of physical and psychological challenges. The desired response was stoicism, discipline, and aggression. The reinforcement came in the form of praise and status for a correct response, and swift, painful punishment for an incorrect one. The very architecture of Sparta reflected their values, and this would have shaped a child's experience. Unlike Athens with its grand Parthenon or Corinth with its opulent temples, Sparta was famously unimpressive in its buildings. Their lawgiver Lycurgus was said to have decreed that houses should have simple roofs made with an axe and doors with a saw and nothing more. The city was meant to be functional, not beautiful. The river Eurotas flowed cold and fast through their land. It was not a place for play. It was the first training ground, its icy water a constant reminder that comfort was an enemy to be defeated daily. The concept of a citizen in Sparta was radically different from that in a democracy like Athens. In Athens, a citizen participated in government, debated policy, and pursued his own interests. In Sparta, a citizen's primary role was to be a soldier. His political rights were limited, and his life was almost entirely controlled by the state. The agoge was the process of creating this specific type of citizen. Let's consider the long-term impact on a man who survived the agoge. He would be incredibly self-disciplined, physically tough, and loyal to his comrades. But he might also be emotionally repressed, lacking in empathy, and intolerant of any deviation from the norm. He would be a superb soldier, but perhaps a difficult husband and a distant father. The system that made him an effective warrior may have damaged his capacity for normal human relationships. The relationship between a Spartan boy and his helot nurse, or attendant if he had one, would have been deeply complex. In his earliest years, this helot woman might have been a source of genuine affection and care, a stark contrast to the austere demands of his Spartan mother. However, as the boy grew older and entered the agoge, he would be taught to despise this same woman and her people. He would learn to see her not as a caregiver, but as a slave, an object of contempt. The crypteia was not just about controlling the helots, it was also about controlling the Spartans. By selecting only the most promising and potentially ambitious youths for this secret police force, the state could identify those who had the capacity for ruthless action. It was a test of their loyalty and their willingness to do the state's dirty work. It also served as a warning to any other Spartan citizen who might consider challenging the established order. The life of a Spartan child was a life without choices. His career was chosen for him, soldier. His education was dictated by the state. His diet, his clothing, and his companions were all determined by the agoge. Even his future wife might be chosen for him, or at least from a very limited state-approved pool. This lack of choice was fundamental to the system. The Spartans believed that individual choice led to selfishness and chaos. It is worth comparing the Spartan childhood to the Athenian one. An Athenian boy of a wealthy family would be educated by private tutors, learning philosophy, rhetoric, poetry, and mathematics. His goal was to become an articulate, well-rounded citizen capable of participating in the democratic assembly. The Athenian ideal was the versatile individual. The Spartan ideal was the specialized soldier. The Spartan system was a closed loop. The children were brutalized in the agoge to become soldiers who could terrorize the helots. The existence of the oppressed helot population was the justification for the brutal agoge in the first place. The fear of a helot revolt fueled the need for more soldiers, which meant more children had to be put through the system. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of oppression and fear. We must acknowledge the element of pride in the Spartan child. While he endured immense hardship, he was also told constantly that he was part of an elite, superior group. He was taught to look down on the luxurious lifestyles of other Greeks as signs of weakness and decadence. This indoctrination would have fostered a powerful sense of arrogance and pride. He was suffering, yes, but he was suffering for a glorious purpose, to become one of the famed warriors of Sparta. The rejection of a candidate by a Sicilian was a form of social death. A man who failed this final vote was called a kakas, a bad man. He was ostracized for life. This final test was not about physical strength, but about character and temperament. The members of the mess hall were voting on whether they wanted to spend the rest of their lives eating and fighting alongside this person. A single blackball could mean the candidate was seen as quarrelsome, unpleasant, or perhaps just not one of them. The education of a Spartan girl gave her a confidence that was shocking to other Greeks. Aristotle, who was no fan of Sparta, complained that the freedom and influence of Spartan women were injurious to the happiness of the state. He was particularly critical of their outspokenness and their management of property. But for the Spartans, this was by design. They needed their women to be strong, confident managers of the home front while the men were away on campaign. 7 years. That was the length of a childhood spent in the home. A fleeting, transient period before the true parent, the state, would claim its property and begin the real, arduous work of forging a Spartan. Let's focus on the first meal a boy had after leaving home for the agoge. It would have been a deliberate shock. After 7 years of eating at a family table, he would now be given a meager, calculatedly insufficient portion of plain food. This meal was his introduction to the institutionalized hunger that would be his companion for the next decade. It was a powerful, physical lesson in the new reality of his life. The agoge was designed to create a very specific type of courage. It was not the reckless, individualistic bravery of a Homeric hero like Achilles. It was the disciplined, collective courage of the phalanx. A Spartan was taught that true bravery was not charging ahead of the line, but holding his position, trusting the men around him, and maintaining the integrity of the shield wall. The Spartan child lived in a world with a very limited future. For a boy, the path was set: agoge, soldier, citizen. There were no other options. For a girl, the path was also set: train, marry a soldier, produce more soldiers. This lack of choice, while oppressive, also provided a kind of certainty. A child never had to wonder what he or she would become. The state had already decided. This removed the anxiety of choice but replaced it with the pressure of performance. The crypteia can also be seen as the ultimate graduation exam in Spartan self-sufficiency. A boy was sent out with nothing and expected to survive. He had to use the skills of stealth, foraging, and theft that he had been taught in the agoge, but now in a real, high-stakes environment. He had to endure loneliness, fear, and the elements, all by himself. It was a test of his individual resourcefulness, a stark contrast to the group-oriented life of the barracks. Let's consider the impact of the system on a father. He had to surrender his son to the state at age 7. He would see him only periodically, and when he did, he was expected to act as another agent of the state, testing and critiquing his son rather than offering paternal comfort. He had to watch his son be beaten, starved, and subjected to immense hardship, and he had to approve of it all as necessary for the boy's development. The Spartan view of truth was pragmatic. The highest value was not truth for its own sake, but loyalty to the state. A boy was taught to be laconic and direct with his fellow Spartans, but he was also taught to be cunning and deceitful with outsiders. The skills of theft and stealth learned in the agoge were, in essence, lessons in how to lie and dissemble effectively. The childhood of a Spartan king's son was, remarkably, not that different from any other boy's. Sparta had a dual monarchy, but the kings were not absolute rulers. They were subject to the law and the oversight of other officials. Crucially, their sons were required to go through the same agoge as every other Spartan boy. They received no special treatment. They had to endure the same hunger, the same cold, and the same discipline. This was a powerful symbol of the Spartan ideal of equality among citizens. The Spartan system was profoundly anti-intellectual. While they valued a specific kind of witty intelligence, they were deeply suspicious of philosophy, abstract speculation, and the kind of critical inquiry that flourished in Athens. They believed such pursuits made men soft and led them to question authority and tradition. A Spartan child's mind was not meant to be opened. It was meant to be sharpened and focused on a narrow range of subjects. The emotional bond between a Spartan girl and her mother would have been centered on their shared duty to the state. A mother would teach her daughter not just how to run, wrestle, and manage an estate, but also how to be a Spartan woman. She would pass on the stories of heroic mothers, the importance of honor, and the necessity of producing strong sons. It was a relationship of mentorship in ideology. The daughter would learn from her mother how to subordinate her personal feelings to her public role. The agoge was a system that demanded constant performance. A boy was always on stage, being judged by his peers, his elders, and the state. There was no backstage area where he could relax and be himself. This need to constantly perform the role of the tough, disciplined Spartan must have created immense psychological stress. The first lesson was not of letters or numbers, but of absence. The absence of excess food, the absence of warm clothing, the absence of a comforting word. They were taught to live and thrive in the void. The ultimate symbol of a Spartan boy's journey is the shield. When he was born, he was judged on whether he would one day be strong enough to carry one. His training was designed to give him the physical and mental fortitude to hold his place in the shield wall. The final injunction from his mother was to return with it or on it. The hoplite shield, the aspes, was large and heavy. It was a communal weapon, its left side protecting the man to his right. The experience of a Spartan boy highlights the immense power of culture to shape human nature. The system took the universal raw materials of childhood, fear, love, hunger, the need for belonging, and channeled them in a very specific and very brutal direction. It shows that concepts we consider natural, like the unconditional love of a parent or the idea of childhood as a time of innocence, are not universal constants. They are cultural constructs that can be, and have been, radically different. Let us consider the diet of a Spartan girl. Unlike her brother in the Agoge, she was not deliberately starved. In fact, she was likely given a plain but nutritious diet, more substantial than that of girls in many other Greek states. The reasoning was purely practical. A well-nourished girl would grow up to be a strong, healthy woman, better capable of enduring childbirth and producing robust infants. The Gerousia's inspection of infants was the gatekeeper of the entire system. By weeding out the weak at birth, the state ensured that the raw material entering the Agoge was already of a certain physical standard. This initial act of selection made the subsequent training more efficient. They were not trying to make strong soldiers out of weak boys. They were trying to make elite soldiers out of boys who were already presumed to be genetically superior. The psychological impact of the secession voting process cannot be overstated. After 13 years of brutal training, a young man's entire future rested on the secret judgment of 15 of his peers. The vote was a definitive verdict on his character. It asked, is this man brave, disciplined, and agreeable enough to be our brother for life? The anxiety leading up to this vote must have been immense. To pass was to be fully born as a Spartan man. The Spartan child was raised in a society that was, by our standards, culturally stagnant. Because they were so resistant to outside influence and so focused on military tradition, they experienced very little of the artistic, philosophical, and political innovation that defined the rest of the Greek world. A child in Sparta would have been unaware of the plays of Sophocles, the sculpture of Phidias, or the philosophy of Socrates. His world was small, rigid, and unchanging. The very act of speaking for a Spartan child was fraught with pressure. The emphasis on laconic wit meant that every utterance was a performance. A boy couldn't just answer a question. He had to answer it in a way that demonstrated his intelligence, discipline, and adherence to the Spartan ideal. This pressure to be constantly clever and concise would have been mentally exhausting. The relationship a Spartan child had with the law was simple. It was absolute and unquestionable. The laws of Lycurgus were considered sacred and immutable. There was no concept of legal debate or reform. The law was a rigid code of conduct that governed every aspect of life, and the child's duty was not to understand it, but to obey it. This created a society of incredible order and discipline, but also one that was incapable of legal or social evolution. Let's reflect on the moment a boy in the Agoge witnessed a battle-scarred warrior. This man was his future, the embodiment of everything he was being trained to become. The scars were not seen as disfigurements, but as badges of honor, physical proof of his courage and his service to the state. The warrior was a living textbook, a tangible goal for the boy to aspire to. Seeing these men, hearing their stories in the mess hall, and hoping to one day earn their respect was a powerful motivational force. The Spartan girl's marriage ceremony itself reflected the state's ideology. The bride would have her head shaved, be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, and be left alone in a dark room. The groom would sneak away from his barracks, capture his bride, and spend a short time with her before returning to his comrades. The ritual mimicked an act of abduction and conquest. It stripped the ceremony of romance and framed it as a practical, almost military transaction. A Spartan boy's name was not truly his own. It was a label on a future shield, a placeholder in a phalanx yet to be formed. His identity was subsumed into the great, singular identity of Sparta itself. The agoge was a system that created a surplus of aggression and then had to find ways to channel it. The constant competition, the physical hardship, and the emphasis on martial virtue produced boys who were primed for violence. The organized brawls, the harsh punishments, and the mock battles were ways to manage this aggression within the system. The crypteia was a way to unleash it on an external target, and war was the ultimate release valve. How did a Spartan child learn about the outside world? It was primarily through the lens of contempt. He would hear stories of the soft Athenians, the money-grubbing Corinthians, and the barbarian Persians. The outside world was presented as a place of chaos, weakness, and moral decay, a stark contrast to the order and virtue of Sparta. This indoctrination gave him a powerful sense of superiority, but also a profound ignorance of other cultures. The Spartan child was part of a rigid caste system. At the top were the homoi, the full citizens like himself who underwent the agoge. Below them were the periok, dwellers around, who were free craftsmen and merchants but lacked political rights. And at the very bottom were the vast numbers of helot slaves. A child learned his place in this hierarchy from his earliest moments. He was taught to command the helots, to tolerate the periok, and to compete with his fellow citizens. The role of the ephors, 5 annually elected magistrates, was crucial in a child's life. The ephors were the ultimate overseers of the agoge. They had the power to punish not only the boys but also the Irenes and even the kings. They conducted periodic inspections of the boys, checking their physical condition. According to one source, they would inspect the boys naked every 10 days to ensure they were lean and fit, not growing soft. The ephors represented the absolute, impersonal authority of the law. Let's consider the concept of home. For most children, home is a place of safety, comfort, and unconditional love. For a Spartan boy, this concept was systematically destroyed. After age 7, his home was the barracks. It was a place of competition, hardship, and constant scrutiny. His family was his pack of rivals. By redefining home as a place of institutional discipline, the state ensured that the boy would never develop a primary loyalty to a private, domestic space. The Spartan obsession with physical perfection would have created a profound body consciousness in every child. A boy knew his body was constantly being judged for its strength, its leanness, its ability to endure pain, its scars. A girl knew her body was being judged for its health, its fitness, and its potential to bear strong children. This constant physical scrutiny would have fostered a strange mix of pride and anxiety. The agoge was a system that ran on shame. The fear of being shamed was a more potent disciplinary tool than any physical punishment. Boys were shamed for crying, for being caught stealing, for giving a slow answer, for showing fear. This constant threat of public humiliation was designed to build an ironclad sense of self-control. The goal was to internalize the shame, so that a boy became his own harshest critic. The Spartan girl's education, while physical, also included what we might call political science. She learned the laws and customs of Sparta, the stories of its heroes, and the ideology of Spartan superiority. This was crucial because she would be the first teacher of her own children. Before her son was taken for the agoge at age 7, it was her responsibility to instill in him the foundational values of the state. She had to be a knowledgeable and enthusiastic agent of the system. The Spartan child lived in a world without economic mobility. A boy was not trained to get a job or make a living. If he was a citizen, his land was farmed by helots, and his sustenance was provided by the state through the mess hall. His only career path was the military. This removed the economic anxieties that plagued many other Greeks, but it also removed economic opportunity and personal initiative. The child's future was secure, but it was also static. The crypteia served as a brutal form of population control. By targeting the strongest and most defiant helots, The Spartans aimed to eliminate potential leaders of a rebellion before they could emerge. It was a preemptive and terroristic strategy. For the boy participating, it was the ultimate lesson in the pragmatism of power. He learned that to maintain control, the state must be willing to commit acts of secret, extrajudicial violence. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing emptiness deliberately engineered. It was meant to sharpen the senses, to make the boy cunning and resourceful, a predator in the making, even within the city walls. The agoge can be seen as an extended rite of passage, a 13-year ordeal designed to transform a boy into a man. It had all the classic elements: separation from the community, a period of liminality and testing where the initiate is stripped of his old identity, and finally, reintegration into the community with a new status. However, unlike the rites of passage in many other cultures, this was not a brief, symbolic trial. The Spartan child's world was one of intense, enforced equality among the citizens. Every boy in the agoge wore the same cloak, ate the same food, and slept on the same hard bed. This was designed to foster a sense of brotherhood and to prevent the jealousies that wealth and privilege could create. This ideal of the homoi, the equals or peers, was the social bedrock of the phalanx. Imagine the sensory experience of a Spartan girl being captured on her wedding night. The darkness of the room, the strangeness of the shorn hair and the man's clothes, the sudden arrival of a husband she barely knew, who had snuck away from his all-male barracks. The entire ritual was designed to be disorienting and to emphasize the groom's dominance and the bride's passivity in this one moment, despite her public confidence. It was a stark, unsentimental initiation into her new role. The lack of written records from the perspective of a Spartan child means we are forced to view them through the eyes of outsiders or through the idealized lens of their own state propaganda. We have the laws, the political theory, and the admiring or critical accounts of other Greeks. But we lack the voice of the child himself. We can only speculate about the nightmares, the secret friendships, the small acts of rebellion, the moments of despair or pride. The Spartans' use of music as a tool of war was highly advanced. Before battle, the king would sacrifice a goat to the gods, and the army's pipers would begin to play. The sound of the pipes was not a chaotic battle cry, but a steady, rhythmic tune that allowed the entire phalanx to advance at a consistent pace, without breaking formation. This calm, ordered advance was terrifying to their enemies, who were used to a frenzied, chaotic charge. The Spartan child was taught to have a deep reverence for age. The elders of the community, especially the members of the Gerousia, were treated with the utmost respect. Boys were expected to give way to them in the street, to stand in their presence, and to listen to them in silence. This was more than just good manners. It was a fundamental pillar of their social order. It reinforced the value of tradition and experience over youthful impetuousness. The system was a gerontocracy, a rule by the old. The agoge was a system that could not tolerate failure. There was no pass-fail option. You either succeeded and became a citizen warrior, or you failed and were cast into a life of shame and inferiority. This binary outcome created immense pressure on every child. It was a high-stakes gamble with their entire future. This unforgiving nature is what made the system so effective at producing excellence in a few, but it was also incredibly wasteful. Let's consider the role of a child in the Spartan economy. He was, in essence, a consumer, not a producer. His life's work would be in the unproductive, from a purely economic standpoint, sphere of warfare. His sustenance depended entirely on the forced labor of the helot population. This economic reality profoundly shaped his worldview. He was born into a leisure class, leisure, that is, from productive labor, which was dedicated to the art of war. The emotional landscape of a Spartan girl would have been complex. She was granted more freedom and status than other Greek women, a potential source of pride. Yet, her primary value was tied to her reproductive capacity. Her body was a public concern, and her most celebrated act was to produce a healthy son and then offer him up to the brutal agoge. She was raised to be a willing accomplice in a system that would take her child away. The end of the agoge did not mean an end to testing. A Spartan man was tested every day of his life. He was tested in the gymnasium, in the mess hall, and on the battlefield. His honor and reputation were always on the line. The training of his childhood was designed to prepare him for this life of constant performance and scrutiny. He was never allowed to simply be. He was always in the process of proving his worth as a Spartan. We are venturing into the heart of Laconia, to the city-state of Sparta, a name that echoes through history with whispers of discipline, courage, and an almost inhuman tolerance for pain. But what was the cost of this legendary strength? Sleep was not a refuge. It was a stolen reprieve on a hard pallet, a brief cessation of training, from which the boy would be roused before dawn to face another day of relentless, soul-crushing conditioning. In the end, the Spartan child is a haunting figure because he represents a path not taken by most of Western civilization. While Athens was laying the groundwork for democracy, individualism, and philosophy, Sparta was perfecting the art of the collective, the state, and the soldier. The Spartan child is the human cost of that alternative vision. His story is a powerful counter-narrative to the triumphant story of Athenian progress. The sheer physicality of the agoge is worth re-emphasizing. A child's life was dominated by bodily sensations, the ache of overworked muscles, the sting of the cold, the bite of hunger, the sharp pain of a whip. Learning was not an abstract, intellectual process. It was etched into the skin and muscle. This focus on the body over the mind created men who were deeply in tune with their physical capabilities, but disconnected from their emotional or spiritual inner lives. The crypteia represents the moment the state's ideology becomes murder. Up until this point, the violence of the agoge was mostly internal: fights, floggings, tests of endurance. But in the crypteia, the violence is turned outward, onto a designated enemy, the helot. This transition is critical. It is the point where the brutalized child becomes a brutalizer. He takes the pain and discipline that have been inflicted upon him and learns to inflict terror and death upon others. What did a Spartan child know of beauty? It was not the beauty of a complex poem, a marble sculpture, or a philosophical argument. For the Spartans, beauty, kalos, was found in order, in discipline, in martial excellence. The beauty was in the perfect, rhythmic advance of the phalanx. It was in the flawless execution of a choral dance. It was in the physique of a well-trained athlete. It was in the stoic endurance of a boy being flogged at the altar. The institutionalized pederasty of the agoge served a crucial social function. It broke the boy's final emotional ties to his family and recentered his emotional world within the all-male military structure. The older mentor lover became the focus of the boy's admiration and desire for approval, a role once held by his father. This intense, one-on-one bond ensured that the boy's loyalty was transferred from the private sphere of the family to the public sphere of the army. The failure of the Spartan system was ultimately a failure of imagination. The agoge was designed to produce perfect copies of the previous generation. It was a system of replication, not innovation. A child was taught to revere the past, not to imagine a different future. This worked as long as the world remained stable and the old methods were effective. The intense loyalty forged in the agoge is perhaps best exemplified by the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit composed of 150 pairs of male lovers. Though Theban, the concept drew from the Spartan model of using erotic bonds to enhance military effectiveness. The idea was that a man would fight more fiercely to protect his beloved and to appear brave in his eyes. The concept of childhood's end in Sparta was not marked by a birthday or a celebration, but by a series of grueling tests. The true end came when a young man was finally admitted to a session. This was his entry into the world of men. From that day on, his primary identity was no longer boy or trainee, but soldier and citizen. He had successfully navigated the brutal 13-year filter designed to weed out the weak. Let us consider the silence of the helot child. While the Spartan child's voice is absent, the helot child's experience is almost entirely unimaginable. They grew up in a world of constant labor and perpetual fear. They witnessed the casual cruelty of their masters. They knew that their father, mother, or older brother could be killed at any time by a roving band of cryptea for simply appearing too strong or too proud. The Spartan girl's famous freedom was, in reality, a form of gilded cage. Yes, she could exercise in public, speak her mind, and own property. But these freedoms were granted to her by the state for a specific purpose, to make her a better mother of warriors. She was not free to choose her own path in life, to pursue art or philosophy, or to marry a non-Spartan. Her life was as rigidly defined by the needs of the state as her brother's. The pack is everything. The individual is nothing. This was the mantra beaten into them, physically and psychologically. Their loyalty was not to family, but to the brothers who shivered and starved alongside them. The psychological doubling required of a Spartan boy was immense. He had to be fierce and aggressive towards his rivals and enemies, but completely submissive to his elders and the law. He had to be cunning and deceitful when stealing, but truthful and direct with his peers. He had to endure extreme pain without showing it, creating a disconnect between his inner experience and his outward expression. The fall of Sparta was not just a military defeat, it was a demographic collapse. The agoge was so harsh, and the criteria for citizenship so exclusive, that the number of Spartan warriors shrank with each generation. They simply couldn't produce enough perfect soldiers to replace their losses in battle. The system that was designed to ensure Sparta's strength ultimately became the source of its fatal weakness. The Spartan child was taught to view his own body as an object, a tool for the state. This objectification began with the infant inspection and continued through every stage of the agoge. His body was honed, disciplined, starved, and beaten not for his own health or well-being, but for its utility as a weapon. This alienation from one's own physical self is a profound form of psychological violence. The role of the mother in the agoge system is a study in tragic contradiction. On one hand, she is the archetypal loving parent. On the other, she is a willing agent of the state that takes her child. The famous sayings attributed to Spartan mothers, "Return with your shield or on it," reveal a psyche that has been forced to elevate civic duty far above maternal instinct. The agoge was a system that created incredible social cohesion, but at the cost of individual resilience. The Spartan man was trained to function perfectly as part of a group, the phalanx. But when the phalanx was broken, as at the Battle of Leuctra, and the men were forced to fight as individuals, they proved less effective. The system had not prepared them for chaos or for situations that required individual initiative. Let us contemplate the absence of art for art's sake. A Spartan child did not draw, paint, or sculpt for self-expression. The poetry he learned was propaganda. The music he played was a marching cadence. The dances he performed were military drills. This utilitarian view of the arts meant that Sparta left behind almost no cultural legacy compared to other Greek cities. They built no great theaters, produced no great philosophers, and left no great epic poems. The story of the Spartan child forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of civilization. We tend to associate civilization with progress, humanism, and individual rights. Sparta offers a different model, a civilization based on stability, order, and the total subordination of the individual to the state. By our standards, their methods were barbaric, but for several centuries, their system was remarkably successful and stable. The entire system of the agoge was an elaborate piece of social theater. Every action, from the public floggings to the choral dances, was a performance designed to reinforce the community's values. The children were the main actors, and their audience was the entire citizen body. They were performing the role of the ideal Spartan, and through this performance, they became it. This public, theatrical nature of their upbringing meant that there was no distinction between private behavior and public identity. The physical environment of the barracks was a key tool of indoctrination. The lack of furniture, the hard beds, the single cloak, these were not just measures of austerity, but a constant physical rejection of the idea of a home. A home is a place of personal comfort and family identity. The barracks were a place of impersonal discipline and group identity. By denying the child the physical comforts of a home, the state denied him the emotional comforts as well. The legacy of the Spartan child is felt even today. The very word Spartan has entered our language to mean austere, disciplined, and minimalist. We use it to describe dorm rooms, diets, and training regimens. But when we use this word, we often forget its dark origin. We forget that the Spartan austerity we admire was born from a system of institutionalized child abuse, slavery, and relentless psychological conditioning. Laughter was a rare sound. More common was the sharp, witty retort, the laconic phrase, a sign of a disciplined mind that wasted nothing, not even breath. Humor was another weapon in their arsenal. The agoge was designed to produce a predictable human product. The state knew that if it subjected a child to a specific set of stimuli, hunger, cold, pain, competition, shame, it would get a specific result, a loyal, tough, and unquestioning soldier. It was a formula for manufacturing men. This mechanistic view of human development is profoundly chilling. It denies the complexity, the unpredictability, and the individuality of the human spirit. Consider the final moments before a Spartan's first battle. A young man, barely out of the agoge, stands in the phalanx. To his left and right are the men he grew up with. Behind him are the veterans he has revered his whole life. He hears the familiar sound of the pipes. He is likely terrified, but his entire childhood has been a rehearsal for this moment. He has been trained to fear shame more than death, to find glory in sacrifice, and to trust the man next to him completely. The story of the Spartan child is ultimately a story of fear. It was the Spartans' fear of their helot slaves that drove them to create the agoge. It was the fear of shame and punishment that drove a boy to endure its hardships. And it was the fear of Spartan military power that shaped the politics of the entire Greek world for centuries. But this reliance on fear as the primary social and political motivator was unsustainable. When we strip away the myths and the romanticism, the life of a Spartan child stands as one of history's most extreme social experiments. It sought to answer a terrifying question: what happens if you sacrifice the individual completely for the sake of the collective? The result was a society of legendary military prowess, but also one of demographic collapse, cultural sterility, and profound inhumanity. To look at the ruins of Sparta today, scattered in a peaceful olive grove beneath the imposing silhouette of Mount Taygetus, is a strange experience. There is little to see of the city's former glory or its brutal reality. The wind whispers through the trees, carrying no echoes of the harsh commands of the paidonomos or the cries of boys at the altar of Artemis. But the silence itself is a testament to the system's ultimate failure. So we are left with this haunting portrait of a childhood lost, a life where every moment, from the first breath to the last, was a test of worthiness. It is a story that compels us to reflect on our own values, on the balance between the needs of the individual and the demands of society. The Spartan child is a ghost from the past, a warning about the allure of perfect order and the terrible price of iron-willed discipline. Narration LIPSA. We think of education as enlightenment. For the Spartan child, education was indoctrination. Stories, songs, and dances all served one purpose: to reinforce the glory of the state and the beauty of a warrior's death. The older boys were not friends, they were masters. They were the first authority, granted the power to test, to punish, to bully, conditioning the younger ones for a life of strict, unquestioning hierarchy. A shadow followed the most promising of these children, a secret, bloody rite of passage known as the crypteia, where the line between boy and monster was deliberately, terrifyingly blurred in the darkness of the countryside. To be caught stealing was a disgrace, not because theft was immoral, but because getting caught was clumsy. The crime was not the act, but the failure of stealth, a lesson in cunning, paid for with a brutal flogging. Even the girls were not spared. Theirs was a different path, but no less rigorous. Their bodies were honed and strengthened, not for the battlefield, but for the birthing bed, the state's other, equally vital frontline. A Spartan girl's athletic prowess was not for her own glory. It was a state mandate, a physical promise that she would produce sons strong enough to endure the brutal system that awaited them. Imagine the quiet moments, if any existed. A boy looking at his own reflection in the water. Did he see himself, or did he only see the warrior he was commanded to become? Was there a person left underneath? Imagine a world painted in stark contrasts. The deep blue of the Aegean Sea against the jagged, imposing peaks of Mount Taygetus. This was the canvas upon which the Spartan identity was brutally etched, a landscape that mirrored the society it cradled. The red cloak was a distant dream, a symbol of manhood achieved. To earn it, a child had to survive a gauntlet designed to break him. It was a finish line that many would never cross. Pain was the great teacher. It taught endurance. It taught silence. It taught that the body was a tool, an instrument that could be pushed far beyond the limits the mind believed possible. The bond between a boy and his mother was the first casualty of the Spartan state. It was a love that had to be severed, a tenderness that had to be cauterized, to make way for the colder, harder love of the barracks. The state was a jealous god, demanding total and absolute devotion. It sought to replace the father with the drill master, the mother with the mess hall, the family home with the communal barracks. At night, in the stark silence of the barracks, did these children dream? Did they dream of food, of warmth, of a gentle hand? Or were their dreams already filled with the clang of bronze and the cries of battle? The system was a relentless filter. It sifted through the children of Sparta, catching the weak, the hesitant, the compassionate, and discarding them, allowing only the most resilient to pass through into the ranks of citizens. A child's world is meant to expand with wonder. In Sparta, a child's world was deliberately narrowed, focused to a single point, the tip of a spear, aimed squarely at the enemies of the state. The concept of self-care was alien. The body was not something to be nurtured. It was something to be mastered, to be disciplined, to be broken and remade in the image of a perfect, unthinking weapon. The girls, running and wrestling in the open, were a strange sight to other Greeks. But this freedom was not for their benefit. It was a calculated investment in the quality of the next generation of Spartan military assets. The ultimate fear for a Spartan boy was not death, but shame. The shame of failure, the shame of showing weakness, the shame of being exiled from the pack. This fear was a more effective whip than any leather lash. Before the warrior, there was the boy. Before the shield wall, there was the nursery. And it is here, in the forgotten story of the Spartan child, that we find the true, chilling price of glory. We must ask, what was lost? In this relentless pursuit of strength, what beautiful, gentle, creative impulses were stamped out before they could ever take root? What artists, poets, and thinkers did Sparta sacrifice? The Spartan child was an offering placed on the altar of the state. A living sacrifice, not of life, but of the very essence of childhood itself, given up in exchange for collective security and military dominance. Their games were not games, they were drills. Their songs were not songs, they were marching chants. Every aspect of their young lives was co-opted and militarized, leaving no room for unpurposed joy. To become a man was not to turn 20, but to survive the process. It was to be accepted into a communal dining hall, the Syssitia, proving you were worthy to eat with the warriors you had been raised to join. The child was born into a debt to the city that allowed him to live, a debt that could only be repaid with absolute obedience in life, and if necessary, a glorious death in its service. Imagine the psychological weight. To know from your earliest memories that your value is entirely conditional, dependent on your ability to endure, to fight, and to suppress every instinct of comfort and individuality. The silence of a Spartan child could mean many things. It could be the disciplined reticence of a future warrior, or the silent scream of a spirit being systematically crushed under the weight of expectation. Their legacy is a paradox. They are remembered as the epitome of martial prowess, yet this was achieved by creating a society that, in many ways, was a prison for its own young, a cage of discipline and fear. The wind that blows across the ruins of Sparta today carries no battle cries. It carries a deeper, more profound silence, the echo of the childhoods that were sacrificed here for the creation of the perfect soldier. This brutal reality was not an accident. It was a design, a deliberate, meticulously crafted system aimed at producing a single, predictable outcome. And it is this system that we must now examine in detail. So join me as we peel back the layers of myth and propaganda to uncover the harrowing and deeply human story of what it truly meant to be a child in ancient Sparta. This is a journey into a world that broke boys to build men. So let us begin at the beginning, not with the heroic warrior at Thermopylae, but with the newborn infant, shivering and exposed, facing the very first trial of a Spartan life, the judgment of the elders. For a child born in Sparta, the first breath was not a guarantee of life. It was the beginning of an immediate and terrifying audition. According to the historian Plutarch, every male infant was taken from his mother and brought before the Gerousia, the council of elders. They would meet at a place called the Lesh, a sort of public colonnade, to examine the baby. This was not a gentle affair. They were not looking for cute features or family resemblances. The fate of an infant judged unworthy by the Gerousia was exposure. The child would be taken to a deep chasm near the formidable Mount Taygetus, a place known as the apotheti, which literally means the deposits. Here, the baby was left to die from exposure to the elements or from attacks by wild animals. If an infant passed this first, terrifying inspection, he was returned to his family, but the state's intervention was far from over. There's a famous, though likely mythical, story that Spartan babies were bathed in wine instead of water, believing that weaker infants would convulse and die while stronger ones would be tempered like steel. While this is probably an exaggeration, it reflects the underlying ethos. For the first 7 years of his life, a Spartan boy lived at home with his family. This period might seem like a normal childhood, but it was merely a prelude, an antechamber to the main event. The state's shadow loomed large over the household. The father was not just a parent, he was the child's first instructor in Spartan values. The mother was not just a nurturer, she was the guardian of the state's investment, tasked with ensuring her son did not become soft or coddled. Then came the turning point, the moment that defined every Spartan male's life, the 7th birthday. On this day, the boy was removed from his family and his home, and formally enrolled in the agoge. This transition cannot be overstated. Imagine a 7-year-old child being permanently separated from his parents, his home, and everything familiar, to be housed in a communal, state-run military barracks with other boys his age. Upon entering the agoge, the boys were organized into packs or herds, called ageli, under the command of an older boy, usually an iron, a youth of around 20. Life in the barracks was a study in planned deprivation. The boys were given only one garment to wear for the entire year, a single cloak, regardless of the season. They were forced to sleep on hard beds they made themselves by pulling reeds from the banks of the Eurotas River with their bare hands. The entire agoge system was overseen by a powerful state official called the paidonomos, or boy herder. This was one of the most respected positions in Sparta, often held by a man of the highest nobility. His authority was absolute. He, along with older citizens who were encouraged to observe the boys, had the right to question, discipline, and punish them at any time. The Irenes, the older youths in their late teens who had survived the system, were also given command over the younger boys' packs. One of the most infamous and misunderstood aspects of the agoge was the institutionalization of theft. The state deliberately underfed the boys, but then encouraged them to supplement their rations by stealing food from farms or even the common messes of the adults. This seems contradictory, but the logic was uniquely Spartan. The goal was not to teach them to be common criminals, but to develop cunning, stealth, and audacity, essential skills for a soldier operating behind enemy lines. Physical pain was not just a consequence of misbehavior in the agoge, it was a core part of the curriculum. Flogging was a common tool of discipline, used to harden the boys and teach them to endure pain without flinching or crying out. The most extreme example of this was an annual ritual at the altar of the goddess Artemis Orthia. Here, young boys were savagely whipped, sometimes to the point of death. The goal was to see who could endure the longest without a sound. In the shadow of the mountain, a life begins not with a celebration, but with an inspection. A tiny, fragile form held up to the cold, calculating gaze of the state, its future hanging precariously in the balance. The intellectual education of a Spartan boy was, by Greek standards, severely limited. While they were taught basic reading and writing, it was considered secondary to their physical and moral training. The Spartans were famously wary of sophisticated rhetoric and philosophy, believing it led to indiscipline and questioning of authority. Instead, their academic focus was on music, poetry, and dance. This wasn't for artistic expression. In place of broad learning, the Spartans perfected a unique form of communication, Laconic speech. The term Laconic comes from Laconia, the region Sparta dominated. It meant using the fewest possible words to express a point, often with a dry, cutting wit. Boys were drilled in this practice, encouraged to give sharp, pithy answers. Long-windedness was seen as a sign of an undisciplined mind. This was more than a stylistic quirk, it was a mental discipline. Life within the age-line, the Boipax, fostered an intense and complicated social dynamic. On one hand, it created an unparalleled sense of brotherhood and esprit de corps. These boys went through everything together: the hunger, the cold, the beatings. They learned to rely on each other for survival, forging bonds stronger than those of blood. This loyalty was the bedrock of the phalanx, where each man's life depended on the man standing next to him. A controversial and often debated element of the agoge was the institutionalized pederastic relationships between the older Irenes or adult warriors and the adolescent boys. This was not equivalent to modern concepts of love or abuse. It was a structured social institution with a military purpose. The older male was meant to serve as a mentor, a role model, and a lover, responsible for the boys' training and moral development. For the most promising, elite graduates of the agoge, there was one final terrifying test of their readiness: the crypteia. The word translates to secret time or the hiding. Selected youths, usually around 18 to 20 years old, were sent out from the city with nothing but a knife. They were instructed to hide during the day and under the cover of darkness to roam the countryside. Their official mission was to survive by their wits, foraging and stealing. The life of a Spartan girl was starkly different from that of her brother, yet it was no less shaped by the demands of the state. Unlike girls in Athens and other Greek city-states, who were confined to the home and taught domestic skills, Spartan girls were enrolled in their own state-supervised educational program. They remained at home with their families, but they did not live a secluded life. Their curriculum was shockingly public and physical. Beyond physical training, Spartan girls received an education in music, dance, and poetry, much like the boys. They participated in choral performances at religious festivals, a key part of Spartan civic life. They were also known for being outspoken and witty, sharing the laconic directness of their male counterparts. This education, combined with their physical prowess, gave Spartan women a degree of freedom and influence unheard of elsewhere in the ancient Greek world. However, this freedom was not about individual fulfillment. The entire purpose of a Spartan girl's upbringing was to make her the ideal producer and guardian of Spartan ideology. Her primary duty was to marry a Spartan citizen and bear strong, healthy children, preferably sons. She was expected to be as mentally tough as her husband, instilling the values of the state in her children from birth. The ultimate test of a Spartan mother was her reaction to her son's fate in battle. As a boy in the agoge approached the age of 20, he faced the final hurdles to becoming a full citizen. He had survived the hunger, the beatings, and the psychological conditioning. He had, perhaps, even endured the crypteia. Now, he had to gain entry into a sicilian, one of the common military messes. These were dining clubs of about 15 men who fought and ate together for their entire adult lives. Upon successful entry into a session and turning 20, the boy was no longer a child. He was a hoplite, a full citizen soldier of Sparta, though he would continue to live in the barracks until age 30. He was now allowed to grow his hair long, a distinctive Spartan military custom, and wear the iconic crimson cloak, the phoenixes, a color chosen to conceal the sight of blood. He was a finished product. The air itself in Sparta seemed different, thinner, charged with an unspoken law. Every stone, every olive tree, a silent witness to a pact made with hardship, a promise that weakness would find no sanctuary here. The psychological impact of this upbringing is difficult to fully comprehend. A Spartan warrior was conditioned to view the world in starkly binary terms: honor or disgrace, victory or death. He was taught to suppress fear, compassion, and even intense joy. His emotional range was deliberately and systematically narrowed. The constant threat of punishment and shame fostered a powerful sense of self-control, but likely also a deep-seated anxiety. It is crucial to understand that this entire brutal system was built upon a foundation of terror. Sparta was not just a city of warriors. It was a city built on the backs of a massive slave population known as the Helots. The Helots were the original inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, conquered and enslaved by the Spartans. They outnumbered the Spartan citizens by perhaps 10 to 1. The very geography of a Spartan boy's life was a map of his conditioning. The Eurotas River was for hardening his body against the cold. The fields and farms of the Helots were for practicing stealth and theft. Mount Taygetus was the ever-present symbol of the state's power to grant or deny life. The gymnasium was for physical contests. The altar of Artemis Orthia was for the ritual endurance of pain. The barracks were for severing family ties and forging military bonds. Let us consider the concept of play in this context. For most children, play is a vital, unstructured activity for social and cognitive development. For a Spartan boy, what passed for play was almost always a thinly veiled form of training. They engaged in organized, often violent mock battles. They had games of strength and endurance. Even their famous choral dances, while beautiful, were exercises in precision and group coordination. The voice of the Spartan child is almost entirely absent from the historical record. We know of them through the writings of later Greeks like Plutarch and Xenophon, or through the lens of archaeology and the stark laws attributed to Lycurgus. We do not have their letters, their diaries, or their personal reflections. We can only infer their internal world through the actions and the society they were forced to build. Did they feel love? Undoubtedly. Did they feel fear? Certainly. The system's success was, for a time, undeniable. The Agoge produced the finest soldiers in Greece. The Spartan phalanx was a terrifying sight, a wall of bronze and crimson, moving with a discipline and cohesion that other city-states could only dream of. Victories at battles like Plataea and their dominance in the Peloponnesian War cemented their legend. For centuries, Sparta stood as the ultimate military power in the Hellenic world. But the seeds of Sparta's destruction were embedded within the very system that gave it strength. The Agoge's relentless filtering process, combined with the constant warfare and the practice of infanticide, led to a severe and irreversible demographic decline. The number of full Spartan citizens, the homoi or equals, dwindled catastrophically over the centuries. At the time of the Persian Wars, Sparta might have had 8,000 citizens. Furthermore, the hyperspecialization of the Agoge created a fatal lack of adaptability. Spartan children were trained to be the best hoplite soldiers in the world, masters of a specific form of pitched battle. But when the nature of warfare began to change, with new tactics, combined arms, and brilliant generals like the Theban Epaminondas, Sparta was unable to innovate. Their education had stripped them of the very creative and flexible thinking needed to respond to new threats. The ultimate legacy of the Spartan childhood is a profound and tragic paradox. It was a system that achieved unparalleled success in its stated goal, the creation of the perfect soldier. Yet this very success led directly to the state's long-term failure. In its obsession with military perfection, Sparta sacrificed everything else: art, philosophy, economic development, and, most importantly, demographic sustainability. When we look back at the brutal reality of being a child in ancient Sparta, it is easy to simply condemn it as monstrous. And in many ways it was. It was a system built on child abuse, on psychological trauma, and on the denial of basic human affection. Yet to the Spartans, it was a logical, even necessary, response to their perilous situation, surrounded by a hostile slave population and rival city-states. A mother's love was a currency the state devalued. Her instinct to soothe, to comfort, was seen as a dangerous indulgence, a crack in the foundation of a future soldier's soul. Her arms were only a temporary harbor. So what can we take away from this journey into a Spartan childhood? It is a stark illustration of the eternal tension between the individual and the collective, between freedom and security. Sparta chose security, and in doing so, created a society of legendary warriors and immense renown. But the price was the innocence, the joy, and the very humanity of its children. Let's delve deeper into the psychological conditioning, specifically the cultivation of what the Greeks called phobos, or fear. For a Spartan boy, fear was not something to be eliminated, but something to be redirected. The fear of the enemy on the battlefield was to be overshadowed by a far greater fear, the terror of shame, of cowardice, of disappointing his peers and the state. This internal fear was a more powerful motivator than any external threat. The role of the helots in a child's life deserves more focus. From a young age, a Spartan boy would have seen helots working the fields, serving in his home, and being subjected to constant humiliation. The state actively encouraged this contempt. For example, Spartans would force helots to drink undiluted wine and perform foolish dances and songs in the common messes. They would bring the children to watch this spectacle, explicitly telling them, "This is what it looks like to be an undisciplined slave." Consider the Spartan diet in more detail. The infamous black broth, or mela zomos, was the staple of the mess halls. It was a vile-sounding concoction of pork, salt, vinegar, and pig's blood. A famous story tells of a visitor from Sybaris, a city known for its luxury, who tasted the broth and said, "Now I understand why the Spartans do not fear death." This wasn't just about sustenance. It was another tool of conditioning. The transition from the agoge to full adulthood at age 30 was another critical phase. Although a man could marry from age 20, he was required to live in the barracks until he was 30. This led to bizarre customs, such as husbands having to sneak out of the barracks at night to visit their wives, and then sneak back before dawn. The purpose was to ensure that even in marriage, a man's primary loyalty and social life remained with his comrades in the secession. Let us examine the concept of disgrace, or atimia, more closely. For a Spartan, losing one's citizenship rights was a fate worse than death. A man could be declared an outcast for various failures, the most common being cowardice in battle. Losing his shield was the ultimate symbol of this. Such a man, known as a tresses or trembler, became a social pariah. No one would speak to him, eat with him, or exercise with him. His daughters would be unable to find husbands. The Spartan relationship with wealth was fundamental to their system. The lawgiver Lycurgus, according to tradition, banned gold and silver coinage, introducing cumbersome iron rods as currency to discourage the accumulation of wealth. While this is likely a romanticized simplification, the principle was real. Spartans were expected to live a life of austerity, free from the corrupting influence of money. A boy in the agoge owned nothing but his single cloak. The soundscape of a Spartan child's life would have been starkly different from our own. It would not have been a world of quiet contemplation. The day would be filled with the sounds of drills, the rhythmic stamping of feet, the sharp commands of the Erinyes, the thud of wooden training weapons, the grunts of exertion from the wrestling pit. At festivals, the air would be filled with the sound of choral singing and the lyre, but these were martial and religious tunes, not personal expressions. The concept of a beautiful death, or kalos thanatos, was drilled into every Spartan child from their earliest years. It was the ultimate aspiration. To die in battle, standing in the line, protecting your comrades, was the most glorious end a man could achieve. Mothers and fathers were expected to take pride in such a death. This wasn't just propaganda, it was a deeply ingrained cultural and religious belief. Let's consider the boy who failed. While the sources focus on the successful graduates, many must have faltered. What happened to the boy who couldn't endure the floggings, who was consistently caught stealing, or who simply didn't have the aggressive temperament to thrive? He would have been subjected to constant ridicule and punishment. If he failed to gain entry to a session at age 20, he would be relegated to a lower social status, losing his rights as a full citizen. The cry of an infant was not just a sound. In this valley, it was a question posed to the elders. Is this cry a sign of strength? Does this small voice have the resonance of a future battle command? The physical landscape of Messenia, the vast territory conquered and farmed by the Helots, played a crucial role in the imagination of a Spartan child. It was the other place. It was the source of Sparta's wealth, but also the source of its greatest fear. It was the dark, wild countryside where the Cryptea operated, a place of danger and testing. While boys were trained for the phalanx, girls were trained for an equally important role, managing the oikos or household. Since the men were almost entirely dedicated to military life, Spartan women held significant economic power. They ran the estates, managed the helots who worked the land, and controlled the family's finances. This was a heavy responsibility that required intelligence, authority, and toughness. The Spartan sense of identity was profoundly isolationist. They were suspicious of foreigners and foreign ideas, which they saw as corrupting influences. The lawgiver Lycurgus was said to have implemented measures to restrict travel abroad for citizens and to expel foreigners who might linger too long. A Spartan child was raised to believe that the Spartan way was the only correct way, and that all other societies were inferior, decadent, and weak. Let's reconsider the inspection of newborns from a different angle. This practice, known as institutional infanticide, had a profound impact on the parent-child bond from the very beginning. For a mother and father, the first days of their child's life were not a period of joyful bonding, but one of intense anxiety. They knew their child could be taken from them by the state. We should also touch upon the religious life of a Spartan child. Sparta was a deeply pious state, but their religion was, like everything else, bent to military and civic purposes. The gods they honored most were those associated with war, courage, and order, like Apollo, Artemis, and the Dioscuri, Castor, and Pollux. Religious festivals were not carnivals of release, but highly disciplined public performances of choral song and dance that reinforced community bonds and state ideology. The idea of personal ambition as we know it was suppressed. A boy's ambition was meant to be channeled into one specific path, to be a brave soldier and a respected member of his session. Ambition for wealth, political power outside the established system, or personal artistic glory was seen as dangerously selfish and divisive. The system was designed to produce uniformity of purpose. The role of storytelling was paramount in the agoge. Since formal literacy was de-emphasized, the oral tradition was incredibly strong. The Irenes and elders would recount the great stories of Spartan history and mythology around the campfire. They would tell of King Leonidas and the 300 at Thermopylae, of the hero Othryades who was the last man standing in a battle, and of the mythical lawgiver Lycurgus. The end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC, a great victory for Sparta, ironically accelerated its decline and corrupted the very system that produced the win. The influx of tribute and wealth from the defeated Athenian Empire began to erode the traditional Spartan austerity. Powerful individuals started to accumulate wealth, creating social divisions that the old system was designed to prevent. This growing inequality put immense pressure on the agoge. Let's think about the emotional expression allowed to a Spartan girl. While she was trained to be tough and outspoken, her emotional life was also circumscribed by the needs of the state. She was expected to show pride in the bravery of her male relatives and contempt for their cowardice. Her grief was meant to be controlled. Her love for her husband was secondary to her duty to the state. Her love for her son was conditional on his becoming a good soldier. The very concept of childhood as a distinct, protected phase of life was largely absent in Sparta. From age 7, a boy was essentially a miniature soldier, a trainee in the profession that would define his existence. There was no clear separation between the world of children and the world of adults, only a ladder of hierarchy and training.